studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, July 29th, 2015. Congress is working on overhauling public education more dramatically than in well over a decade. We'll turn to education historian Diane Ravitch about the changes being proposed and how they could affect students and teachers. And journalist Roberto Lovato has just published a major expose about Leopoldo Lopez, the new leader of the Venezuelan opposition. He'll join us to explain Lopez's links to the U.S. establishment and more. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
Afghan and Pakistani sources are claiming that the mysterious leader of the Afghan Taliban, Mullah Muhammad Omar, is dead. Mullah Omar has not been seen in public for well over a decade, and rumors of his death have appeared several times over the years. Afghan government officials made the claims this morning and say they are investigating the fact that the elusive Taliban commander may have died 2 years ago. As of this morning, there has been no statement from the Taliban confirming or denying the news of his death. According to Pakistani media, Omar's son, Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, has been jockeying for leadership of the organization. The Taliban was about to begin a second round of peace talks in Islamabad with Afghan government officials aimed at ending the violent 13-year-long conflict. In mid-July, AFP reported that Mullah Omar lauded the peace talks through the Taliban's official website, saying, quote, "All mujahideen and countrymen should be confident that in this process I will unwaveringly defend our legal rights and viewpoints everywhere." Well, Courtney, it's not possible to say whether or not he's alive, of course, but if his death is confirmed, could it derail these peace talks?
Well, certainly. I mean, there is a fairly intense power struggle unfolding in the Taliban right now between those members of the organization who are prepared to enter into peace talks with the government and hardliners in the group who still continue to feel very strongly that fighting against the government should continue until all foreigners have been expelled from Afghanistan. So, hardliners in the group have also been getting a bit of a kind of ideological boost with the presence of a local chapter of the self-proclaimed Islamic State, which recently emerged in the country. And there is a real fear among both group individuals inside of the group as well as experts outside who are watching this development very closely, that hardliners who are frustrated by the Taliban's decision to engage in peace talks with the government, that those hardliners may in fact switch their allegiance to ISIS and create further conflict, deepen the conflict in the country already. So this really seems to be a misinformation campaign designed specifically to destabilize the peace talks. I think the real question is who's behind it. And who's really driving this misinformation campaign.
Here in the U.S., news of another police killing of an unarmed African-American man is making headlines. On July 19th, Samuel DuBose was shot in the head by a white University of Cincinnati police officer, Ray Tenzing, who pulled him over for not having a front license plate. The prosecutor in the case has refused to release the body camera worn by Tenzing, saying, quote, "It is not good," and implying that it disputes Tenzing's claims of self-defense. The city is apparently bracing itself for riots in the event of the video's release. DuBose's funeral took place yesterday. Meanwhile, in the Texas police custody death of Sandra Bland, Waller County prison officials have released a new video showing Bland getting her mugshot photo taken. They were responding to rumors that Bland may have died before she entered the prison. Officials say the prison is receiving death threats. Courtney, how important is it for us to demand the release of each and every single video over a contentious arrest or police killing?
I guess it could seem a bit tedious having to demand this footage over and over and over again, but I think it's going to remain critical to do so until transparency and accountability become standard operating procedure for police departments. I think what we're seeing in both the Samuel DuBose case and the Sandra Bland case is that the public really does not trust the police, particularly communities of color do not trust the police, do not take them for their word. And the truth of the matter, as far as I can tell, is that the police really have not given those communities any reason to do so. I think that if the police are serious about rebuilding the broken relationship between policing institutions and the communities that they are paid to serve, transparency is going to be needs to be the order of the day, and sharing that footage is an important step in repairing the rift between police and those communities.
And finally, the political circus around Donald Trump's candidacy for the presidency continues. Because his poll numbers among potential Republican voters are so high, news media are obligated to cover the businessman turned politician. Now, Politico is reporting that the billionaire Koch brothers, who have financed most major Republican candidates, are freezing Trump out. According to the Politico report, the network of Koch-backed policy and political outfits is using behind-the-scenes influence to challenge Trump more forcefully than the Republican Party establishment by limiting his access to the support and data that would help him translate his lead in the polls into a sustainable White House campaign. Meanwhile, Trump has said he would invite Sarah Palin into his cabinet if he were to be elected president. Well, Courtney, Newsweek published an op-ed saying that the Republicans brought the Trump circus on themselves. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree. I think Donald Trump is the GOP's worst nightmare. He's a wildcat candidate who has the financial resources to back his own campaign, fund his own campaign, and cannot be controlled by either the party or their corporate funders. And, I think that the Newsweek article absolutely hits it on the head. The GOP has no one to blame for the rise of Donald Trump but themselves. Over the last 40 years, the GOP has really been instrumental in creating the kind of culture of political mudslinging and rhetorical mean-spiritedness that has completely diminished our sort of political process here in the United States. And so it's interesting to see that the GOP's base really responds to this style of politics, which is precisely why Donald Trump is proving to be so popular among them. So, again, the GOP has no one else but themselves to blame for Donald Trump's popularity.
Courtney, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The GOP-dominated House and Senate are currently overhauling public education in a manner that could have a far-reaching impact. The House passed a version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that would rewrite many aspects of the bill, which was reincarnated under the George W. Bush administration as the No Child Left Behind Act. The House bill, which narrowly passed in early July, enables what conservatives like to call school choice, but also includes a mechanism for parents to opt their children out of standardized tests. The Senate version of the bill diverges from the House version significantly, and as a result of a compromise with Democrats, it will have to be reconciled with the House version in a conference committee before President Obama could sign it into law. But how much attention do lawmakers pay to what actually happens in public schools when they craft such bills? Joining me to discuss what's at stake in the education bill is Diane Ravitch. She is an education historian and author of The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. Her latest bestseller is called Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. Welcome to Uprising, Diane.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Well, how important is this overhaul? It hasn't received very much news attention. I understand this is essentially the most dramatic change to the education bill since No Child Left Behind, but that was 14 years ago?
Right, correct. No Child Left Behind was supposed to have been rewritten in 2007, but it created a dilemma. Congress literally didn't know how to get out of this testing conundrum that they're in, because No Child Left Behind is actually a rewrite of something called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And that act was passed as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. Hold me, I just have to take this phone off the hook. ESEA was part of the War on Poverty. Its purpose was to send money to schools that had children in poverty. Over the years, especially starting in the Clinton administration, the idea became popular. Well, maybe we shouldn't send the money out unless we know that the kids are actually getting higher test scores. George W. Bush pushed this law to another level altogether, turning into a law for testing and accountability and for punishing teachers, punishing principals, and closing schools if the test scores didn't go up. So we have a law that totally evolved from what was supposed to be one for equity for poor kids and resources for poor kids into a law that punishes poor kids and closes their schools if they don't get higher test scores. So once No Child Left Behind became law, it became a kind of a mandate that every child every year must be tested. And no senator, no congressman really had the nerve to stand up and say, this is not producing better schools, it's just enriching the testing industry. And so finally, this year, Congress is prepared to move on it, but I think the problem is we have a Congress where both houses are controlled by Republicans. But frankly, even the Republicans are sick of all the micromanagement from Washington, D.C. And so they're backing away a little bit. They're saying you have to test every year, which no other nation, by the way, does. You must test every year, but it's up to the state to decide whether to punish the teachers in the schools, not the federal government.
Now, and just to back up a little bit, under the Obama administration, the sort of testing regimen was made even more concrete through the Race to the Top initiative, right? But that was sort of on top of the No Child Left Behind bill, a separate initiative.
Right. It actually was taking the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind and doubling down on them. Secretary Duncan and I assume President Obama, who appointed him, believed that everything should be tested, that every child should be tested, and that teachers should be evaluated based on the test scores of their students. This is a really bad idea. It doesn't work anywhere. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars have been spent recalibrating evaluation systems, and yet there's not a single district in America that will say, this has worked. It has not worked. In fact, what's happened since the recalibration of the evaluation systems is that in state after state, somewhere between 96 and 98% of the teachers are found to be either effective or highly effective. So these systems don't work, but it has created pressure for high stakes testing. It's created even more pressure than there was under No Child Left Behind, and No Child Left Behind is still the law of the land.
So let's talk about the two versions of the bill. The House passed a version of the bill that agrees with the Senate version on some aspects but diverges on other aspects. The House version of the bill, which is called the Student Success Act, it was essentially done without very much Republican support. And can you explain the choice aspect of this bill? Of course, and Republicans like to use the word choice a lot, but essentially this would allow public school students to attend the school of their choice, so take the dollars that are supposed to fund their education to any school, and that, if that went on long enough, essentially you'd have schools that got lots of money and then schools in poor neighborhood that got very little money?
Well, actually, you made a misstatement. It was passed in the House with very little Democratic support.
Oh, right.
The Democrats are the minority party, and the Democrats were not going to support something that said, strap a backpack full of cash on every child's back. Because what the House bill really is about is vouchers. And this has been the goal of a very far right-wing, really extremists in the Republican Party, wanting to have a full choice so that kids can choose to homeschool and be paid by the government. Kids can go anywhere and say the money will follow them. Democrats have had some lingering attachment to the public school system, although Democrats fully supported the charter aspects of the Senate bill. And there's a lot of new money and new authorizations for charter schools in the Senate bill, but the voucher idea was voted down in the Senate. So when they go to conference, you'll have the Senate bill, which is really a much better bill, a more moderate bill, conference with a very radical right-wing bill coming from the House of Representatives.
So there's the charter school aspect of these education bills. There is the testing aspect of it, which, as you mentioned, they're going to pull back from just a little bit, leave it more up to the states. Then there's a teacher evaluation bit of these bills. And let's talk about that, because teacher evaluation, teacher pay, etc., is being linked to test scores under the current version of the bill. This is something teachers' unions have fought against. What is the current status in the new bills that were just voted in, and do the House and Senate versions agree?
Well, the Senate version is very clear that there will be no federal mandate requiring states to link teacher evaluation and student test scores. This, by the way, was I would say the signature policy of Arne Duncan as Secretary of Education. Was his belief that districts could use test scores to evaluate teachers, and it has been a national failure that's cost many hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. In the Senate bill, it says this is a decision left to the states. Now, for people who have been, like me, very frustrated by, first of all, Arne Duncan's very active role in imposing policies of privatization and also of evaluating teachers by test scores, the Senate bill is a big improvement because it says the federal government will not get involved in this. It'll be left to the states. Some people say, well, this is going to be hard. Now we're going to have 50 fights. But I do think that the people who are opposed to this misuse and overuse of standardized testing will have more influence at the state level than they have at the congressional level, because frankly, there is very little way to influence Congress. Most members of Congress don't pay much attention to education, don't have much contact with teachers, have no idea how things are working out in the classroom, and they only listen to their ideological campmates. So I would say the Senate bill is a big improvement. I'm not sure what the House bill says about teacher evaluation, but I think that in both cases, both sides of the House and Senate, because they are Republican, they want to see a reduction of the federal role in education. In the past, Democrats have fought against this because states' rights have never been a good thing for equity and civil rights. But Arne Duncan so overplayed his hand in forcing through things that he believed in, like teacher evaluation tied to test scores, and like more and more charter schools, which cause intensified segregation, that even the Democrats are willing to put in all of these limits on the federal role. So it's a very complicated situation because you have many people on the left saying that they actually support the Senate bill. And it's going to be very interesting to find out what comes out of that conference committee, because there was a vote taken, and it was a very crucial vote on the Senate side about whether to pass something called the Murphy-Booker Amendment. The Murphy-Booker Amendment was voted for by every single Democrat, and it would have retained all the punishments of NCLB. So the politics are very confusing because you have the Democrats now basically hanging on to the George W. Bush sanctions and punishments. And every Republican, except I think there may have been one or two that didn't go along with it, but it was the Murphy-Booker Amendment was voted down because the Republicans didn't want the federal government to be punishing and closing schools. They thought that was overreach. I think they're right, because if we really want to improve schools, we have to recognize the root causes of low academic performance, and the most important root cause is poverty. Now, will the states recognize that? I don't know. Has the federal government for the last 15 years recognized it? Not at all. The federal government has, if anything, treated testing as the answer to poverty, and it's not. It's a really illogical response.
Now, in the House version of the bill, I understand there is an amendment that was passed that would allow students to skip standardized testing, which seems to be one of the few good things about that version of the bill. Have you heard about this?
Yes, the House bill supports the idea of parents have the right to opt their children out of the test. And the tests today are aligned with the Common Core. So there's a tremendous uprising against them. And there are many parents who have made this decision saying, if the tests are not valid, if they're not reliable, if they're going to tell me that my child has failed even before he's taken the test. I mean, what's happened in every state has been that the passing rates have dropped precipitously because the tests are anywhere from 1 to 2 grade levels above where the kids are. The Senate, on the other hand, did not include an opt-out provision, and they said that Senator Lamar Alexander, who was the chairman of the committee, said that he didn't want the federal government to mandate that states should allow opt-outs, that should be a state decision. I mean, that's somewhat contradictory because on the one hand, the federal government mandates annual testing, but will not mandate the parents' right to not take the test. They're leaving that up to the states. Now, you have to understand, there is no high-performing nation in the world that has annual testing. The other nations that we think of, the ones that do very well on the international tests, like Japan and Korea, South Korea, and Finland, Canada, those countries give a test usually at the end of 6th grade. In Canada, it's in 3rd grade and in 6th grade. And in Finland, they have no standardized testing at all. So we somehow believe that we can't produce equity without testing, and there's no evidence that testing produces equity. What it does is that it produces failure, and it forces all of the kids into the bell curve, and the bell curve never closes.
Diane Ravitch, you recently wrote about the suicide of a New York City principal named Janine Worrell Breeden, who jumped in front of a train and killed herself. She had been facing accusations of changing test scores on Common Core exams. What does this regimen of testing do, not just to the students, but also the teachers and the principals involved?
Well, on my blog, I hear from teachers and principals every day, and they're sick of all of this because they feel that the regime of high-stakes testing they're now being required to teach scripted lessons in many districts and states, and they feel that it's destroying their professional autonomy. It's taking away from them their ability to exercise judgment about what children need. And many are simply leaving the profession. This principal was accused of cheating, of filling in the answers. She said that many of the students were unable to finish the test, and she had only 3rd graders taking the test. It's a K through 3 or pre-K through 3 school, and so her children for the first time were taking the test, and according to the charges against her, she had finished the test for them because she didn't want to have a high failure rate. She didn't want them to be labeled as failures. And then when she was reported, she jumped in front of a subway train and killed herself. I mean, this is so awful. There was a suicide a few years ago in Los Angeles, where a teacher, Rigoberto Ruelas, threw himself off a bridge after the test scores were published, and he was called an ineffective teacher. He apparently, from everything I've read about him, was a very effective teacher teaching in a tough school. And he was crushed by this judgment that was published by the Los Angeles Times. So I think that we've gone overboard with the standardized testing. The only ones that benefit are not the teachers, not the children, but the testing companies. And Pearson and McGraw-Hill have been cleaning up with this explosion of testing that's taken place since the passage of No Child Left Behind.
And speaking of standardized testing at the higher education level, George Washington University made news this week by joining a growing number of colleges and universities that are allowing students who apply to be students to opt out of submitting their SAT scores. And I'm wondering how important that is. I mean, this is, of course, we're talking about the the higher education level rather than K through 12. But still, is this part of this growing sentiment that standardized tests are just not effective at measuring student success?
What the research shows, and even the testing companies acknowledge this, is that the SAT and the ACT are less successful at predicting success in college for a student than their 4-year grade point average. So you're putting a one-day snapshot of student performance, which may or may not show their skills and knowledge, versus 4 years of their persistence and work. And given the fact that you can learn more from their 4-year grade point average, there are now about 800 colleges that have said We don't require an SAT or an ACT test. If you want to take them and send your scores in, you can, but we don't care if you do or not. So that has allowed many students who want to apply to really some of the best colleges in the country have said this. So I think that's another point against standardized testing. You know, you remind me that in Florida, they've just passed a law saying that they'll pay a bonus to new teachers of $10,000 based on their SAT scores and ACT scores, which is totally stupid because this is a test that they take as juniors or seniors in high school, and yet 5 years later, they're going to be given a bonus if they enter teaching. As a result of this law, there will be brand new teachers making more money than people who've been teaching for 10 or 15 years.
Wow. Finally, Diane Ravitch, we have a very, very long drawn-out presidential campaign heading into next year's elections. And Arne Duncan, as you said, really should be seen as a reflection of the man who appointed him, which was President Obama. What do you make of the what most people are, imagining would be the likely Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, and her position on education? She has had a long political history leading into this campaign. Do you have any sense that Clinton may appoint somebody better than Duncan?
Well, I would say that the choice is going to come down to probably Hillary Clinton and one of the 17 Republican candidates. Yeah. And I would say that whoever she chooses will be better than anyone chosen by those 17 people. Even Jeb Bush, who poses as a moderate, is one of the most radical right-wing governors in the country when it comes to education. Scott Walker is even to the right of Jeb Bush. What Donald Trump will do, I haven't seen his education platform.
Oh, boy.
But I have no doubt that Hillary Clinton would be responsible in choosing a secretary. And I think, and I hope, she would learn from the mistakes that Duncan and Obama have made. And she has not yet said anything much about education other than a speech that she gave to the American Federation of Teachers, in which she basically spoke in platitudes. But I hope to have the opportunity in the next few months to have some time with her and learn in more depth whether she understands the dire threat to public education today. And public education is being privatized at a dramatic clip. We are losing public schools. For example, in Los Angeles has more students in charter schools than any city in the country. These are schools that are lightly audited, unsupervised by the state in terms of the use of public dollars, and they're privately managed. That's privatization. And that movement is creating a dual school system. So we are, in effect, reverting back to the days of having a dual school system, which is what we had before the Brown versus Board decision of 1954. Then it was based on race. Today it's based on other factors. Is this student a good fit? Are they likely to have high test scores? Are they likely to be less expensive to educate? I mean, charter schools have a record of being more segregated, even in highly segregated districts. They also tend to avoid kids with severe disabilities. And there are many charters across the country that have very few students who are English language learners. So I think that the privatization is occurring at a rapid pace. And the other thing that's happening is the commercialization of public education money. There are now equity investors who meet regularly to talk about how to make money in the public education sector. They see this as a huge pot of public money that has been thus far untapped by the markets. And they are busily figuring out ways how to tap in through consultants and software and hardware. And frankly, the Common Core standards have been a bonanza for the entrepreneurs, because now everything changes, right. And this creates opportunities to say, my product is Common Core aligned, you must buy my product.
Right. Well, Diane, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We'll post a link to your blog from our website later today, dianeravitch.net. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to talk to you again.
My guest is Diane Ravitch. She is an education historian, and her latest best-selling book is Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The Venezuelan government has been expected to restart the trial of jailed opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez. The telegenic Lopez has become the main symbol of Venezuelan disaffection with its government. He has been imprisoned for a year and a half for his role in inciting violence during demonstrations. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro had been in negotiations with U.S. State Department leaders earlier this month over Lopez's fate. Along with another imprisoned dissident, Lopez had reportedly been on a 30-day hunger strike. But who exactly is Leopoldo Lopez, and why does he matter? Joining me to answer that question is my guest, Roberto Lovato. He is a writer for The Nation magazine, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for Latino Policy Research, and his article, The Making of Leopoldo Lopez, was just published in Foreign Policy. Welcome to the show, Roberto.
Glad to be with you again, Sonali.
So Lopez is actually, I was surprised to find from your article, descended from Simon Bolivar himself, for whom the Bolivarian Revolution is named, which the late Hugo Chavez worked so much to uphold. That's highly ironic.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. I mean, different people trace their lineage to very influential people. Like Lopez is also descended of one of the presidents of Venezuela. So he comes from a very, I think, elite pedigree. He himself has called himself from the 1%. You know, during an interview with his college magazine, the magazine from Kenyon College, he talks about being from the 1%. And you know, he's gone to school with Saudi princes, with you know, the children of schools that have the children of presidents and Fortune 500 you know, the children of Fortune 500 people. So yeah, I mean, if you look at his background, he comes from the very top of Venezuelan society. And the question for me as a journalist was, being in Venezuela and knowing Venezuela to have being a very poor country like in Latin America, how is it that somebody who comes from, again, by his own admission, from the 1%, comes to represent, quote unquote, revolution? How is he the person that Newsweek called the revolutionary, quote unquote, that has everything? Or in the same article, Newsweek saying that he had, you know, twinkling chocolate colored eyes, quote unquote. So, I mean, these struck my curiosity, knowing Venezuela, knowing that most of the protests that people saw last year were in the eastern elite part of Venezuela. I'm here in New York right now, and I compare it to Park Avenue. It'd be like Park Avenue was the site of protests in the United States, and that international media came and covered and looked at Park Avenue as representative of the rest of the country, and that's just not the case. I mean, I even took, in my disbelief, I took pictures of people's shoes at the protests last year, and I have pictures of dozens upon dozens of high-end Nikes, high-end Adidas, and other shoes that most Venezuelans can't afford.
You mentioned Kenyon College, Kenyon. It's a small liberal arts college in Ohio, where you say he developed relationships that would serve him to this day. Let's talk about some of those relationships. Once Lopez was catapulted onto the international scene, he essentially called upon his network developed here in the United States to launch an international campaign to draw light to what's happening to him. So tell us about the contacts that he made here in the U.S. through his college connections.
You know, to write this article, I scanned through government cables that were leaked, Venezuelan parliamentary and other documents from the government. I looked through video clips, news reports. I interviewed members of his family, and I interviewed some of his friends, including a gentleman named Rob Gluck, who is the head of something called Friends for a Free Venezuela, and that's also the sponsor of something called, a website called freeleopoldo.com. And, you know, Gluck was a schoolmate of his, and went on after they were in school to become a Republican operative with Arnold Schwarzenegger's bid to get Gray Davis out of, you know, California's governorship, a successful campaign. And he also worked on Lamar Alexander's presidential campaign. And is very focused on PR. As is another gentleman named Leonardo Alcivar, who worked on the Romney campaign for president and in communications, and with the George Bush administration in communications. So there's a very strong Republican GOP and other, I mean, I'm sure there's Democrats in their mix too, very influential people in communications, law, artists and others who have come to support through Free Leopoldo. And what was interesting was that when I was interviewing Mr. Gluck, I asked him if he was on the payroll of Lopez. He said no, but that he was on the payroll of the Lopez family.
Okay, there's not much of a difference there.
Yeah, so I mean, he's working for both the nonprofit and is being a paid consultant to Lopez's family, according to the interview I did.
So just to summarize, Robert Gluck, a man that he went to school with in Ohio at Kenyon College, was helped to mobilize this international campaign to free Leopoldo, which is a very effective social media campaign that translated even onto some street corners here in the United States with Venezuelan who are Venezuelans living in the United States. And this was then mobilized to give the impression that there is a vast and mass popular uprising against the Venezuelan government, right?
Well, I mean, I'll let people look at what happened last year on their own. I really focused on looking more at how they operated and specifically at Leopoldo Lopez and his allies' claim to be advocates for democracy and supporters of the Venezuelan Constitution in particular. Right? Because that seems to me the key claim. If you look at statements by Lopez or by his lawyers, they often, and his allies, they often reference the Venezuelan Constitution and that they are all about promoting democracy in Venezuela. So I looked at kind of the democratic credentials of Leopoldo Lopez and his allies. Now, and what I found was contradictions between statements that were made about democracy and Lopez, and other things that Lopez said and did that don't seem exactly in line with democracy. As for example, his role, which he's denied, as has his lawyers, denied his role in the coup. They've said that they were not in any way part of the coup in 2002 of Hugo Chavez, and that they were not, in contact or dealing with the business leaders who were organizing the coup. So I went and I looked into these claims, and I found contradictions. I found parliamentary discussions where Lopez was stated that he had, where there were recordings of TV interviews where Lopez, you can hear and see Lopez say, I was in contact with he said that they were the president of Venezuela, the new president Carmona, knows of the arrest of a Chavista minister who I interviewed named Chacin. So, I mean, there's parliamentary records, there's YouTube videos where you can see Lopez clearly showing support for the coup, celebrating the ouster of Chavez in front of thousands of people on April 9th at a big protest. Those YouTube videos are there. I mean, the evidence was pretty large.
And this is his role in the 2002, or the possibility of his role in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. Let's talk about what the U.S. State Department has said privately about him. The diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks show that at one time, the State Department called Lopez a divisive figure within the opposition who is often described as arrogant, vindictive, and power-hungry, but party officials also concede his enduring popularity, charisma, and talent talent as an organizer. So is it possible that the State Department's opinion of him changed from what it was then to something different now, given that they were negotiating with the Maduro government about his trial? I mean, why is the U.S. State Department negotiating with the Maduro government about the trial of a dissident?
Yeah, I couldn't really tell you. I don't have those kinds of tea leaves, but I wish I did. But I can say that if you look at those State Department cables, and there's a considerable amount of them, they do show Lopez to be, in the eyes of the State Department, a very capable organizer who early on, as early as 2007, the State Department cables say that he was already working behind the scenes with the student movement. Okay, the student movement that you saw in 2014 be the central actor, right? And remember, we're at a time when students in the worldwide movements are playing a definitive and central role in everything from Black Lives Matter to Arab Spring to everything. So the State Department, and I think Lopez, as described in the cables, were prescient in focusing on Venezuelan youth. And so many of those Venezuelan youth leaders are now part of Lopez's party, Voluntad Popular. Some involved in a group called, even including some involved in a group called HAVU, which is also mentioned in the cables. The group is mentioned in the cables. So it's interesting because one of HAVU's founder, Laurent Saleh, was recently arrested late last year on charges of terrorism and other stuff. And there are video clips. I encourage people to look up Laurent Saleh, Saleh, on YouTube, and you can see the tapes where Saleh describes, and some allies of Saleh's on tape, saying that they are planning bombings, that they're planning assassinations, that they're planning a bunch of things that the U.S. media largely ignored, right? Because, I mean, this is part of my interest in writing the story, is that I was in Venezuela hearing these things. I saw those YouTube tapes, and I didn't see much talk about this in the U.S. media. So I thought, well, let's look into this. And sure enough, I found that Saleh, one of the founders of HAVU, is accused and admitting basically to terrorist acts on tape.
And yet these are the folks who we are being told are representative of some kind of democratic uprising in Venezuela against an authoritarian government the U.S. likes to describe the Maduro government, and before him the Chavez government, as, which is what makes Lopez's case so interesting and important. You also describe in your article in Foreign Policy about his meeting with Pedro Burelli in the U.S. This is essentially an oil and gas executive. He also has connections, not just, of course, with higher ups and formal executives and and people with influence in the U.S., but not at all surprising, he very much maintains those connections within Venezuela as well, right?
Yeah, there are YouTube videos of recordings of conversations between Borelli and an anonymous military man who he didn't want to tell me it was. And I think the man's identity has been revealed, but I have to go back and look at his name. But at the time that I did the interview with Borelli, he didn't tell me the guy's name. But you see on the YouTube tapes that you can hear them talking about what's going on in your collective, and in a context of, the military being the one part that's needed right now to really tilt the oppositional movement of last year to topple the Maduro government. This is on the implicit in the recordings, and the Venezuelan government released some emails they allege are Borelli's. Borelli said that he hired some experts to show that the emails released by the Venezuelan government were false, and that Google certifies that they're false. And so I asked him about that, but when I asked him about the tapes, he said, "Yeah, that's me, but that conversation could be had with anybody in Venezuela," he told me. And Borelli has been, by his own admission, an advisor to a personal friend, a personal scratch advisor. He's not a formal advisor. He's been I think he called it an informal advisor, and a quote, very good friend of Lopez, who's talked to him about his career throughout all the different phases of Lopez, from when he was, a young mayor and in the Primero Justicia party, to his rise in 2014 to be pretty much at the center of the opposition right now, which is very divided, right? That's an important part of what my story is about, is that the Lopez within the opposition is a very divisive figure, something you don't see in most U.S. reports of media. They seem almost to cheerlead for the Venezuelan opposition, and if you look at the fact that there's very little, the voice of the families of Chavista victims does not appear in most of the reporting in the United States, right? There were about 43 people killed during last year's upheavals. Half of them were killed, about half were killed by the government. The other half was killed by violent segments of the opposition, right? You heard the voices in some media reports of the Venezuelan opposition families of the victims that were killed last year. You have hardly heard, even known about, the families of the Chavistas that were killed last year.
Right. And of course, from the U.S. Media coverage, it seemed like, a very black and white picture with the Venezuelan government and its authoritarian forces, quote unquote, on one side and this mass uprising on the other side. Now, I want to ask you, Roberto, what role Leopoldo Lopez's wife, Lilian Tintoro, has played in all of this. And of course, the U.S. media is unsurprisingly very excited about featuring this very telegenic couple. I mean, they're essentially like a Barbie and Ken doll versions, of real life dissidents that are also, in their eyes, upholding democratic values.
Well, I had the opportunity to go to Chacao, a park in Chacao called Palo Verde, where there was an event for political prisoners in Venezuela. It was in the rich neighborhood, and it was mostly middle and upper class people gathered to, advocate for the freedom of Lopez and other what they call political prisoners. And the center of the event was Lopez's family, his wife and his father. His mother was there, but she didn't really speak, and they both spoke, and I have to say they were very impressive and on message in terms of what they're advocating and what they believe. I think her skills as a former TV host, a reality TV show star, a kite sports. Somebody involved with kites. What is that when in the ocean?
I'm not sure.
One of those stars with athletic feats with the big kites and the surfboard.
Okay.
And her skills were on display at the event, and they're on display in the media. She's a formidable communicator, as is Lopez, and the whole operation is I think the whole Lopez and the opposition movement is very media savvy. You have the U.S. operation with Free Leopoldo. You have the fact, for example, that his mother's a top executive with the Cisneros Group, one of the major media conglomerates in the world. And
does she make use of her influence in the media inside Venezuela?
I didn't include that in my story. I did include the fact that and noted that she is an executive. There are folks can look on WikiLeaks. I didn't put it in my story, but there's an interesting WikiLeaks cable about a meeting between Lopez's mom, Maria Antonieta Lopez, in her capacity as a vice president with the Cisneros group, and another gentleman from a media outlet, and Deborah McCarthy, the political charge d'affaires of the Venezuelan embassy in 2007. And it's interesting, the conversation they have there, where McCarthy appears to be asking them to, pressuring them almost, to take a stronger role in promoting the student movement, and actually received reassurances from both Lopez and Lopez, Maria Antonieta Lopez, and the other person, that they that Cisneros and the television company will in fact are doing their part, quote unquote, behind the scenes to support students. So I didn't put that in my story, but there's again, I'm not quoting verbatim a WikiLeaks cable. People can look and go look at the WikiLeaks cables that mention Maria Antonieta Lopez, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Now let's also talk about how Lopez and his supporters very aggressively and effectively use the word democracy and the idea of democracy to fulfill their goals, which is, of course, another reason that it gets picked up in the media, even though, as you mentioned, he is not necessarily popular among the other aspects of and the other figures inside Venezuela among the opposition. But he is claiming to uphold this idea of democracy. The social media campaign that has been generated around Venezuela has been very, very effective. And how much of that is true? I mean, Robert Gluck, whom you interviewed, you mentioned he considers Leopoldo Lopez a leftist. I mean, is he? What are his real politics, personally, as far as you can tell?
I think you'd have to look at the political positions taken by Voluntad Popular. They've also, until, I think, for many years they've been members of the Democratic Unity Roundtable, the MUD. And if you look at the platform of the MUD, it's not what I think you could actually call progressive or liberal, even in terms of the stated desire to dismantle the advances in housing, the advances in education, the advances in different parts of the social fabric of Venezuelan society. The MUD, which up until recently Lopez and Voluntad Popular have been members of, as has all the opposition, is not very progressive. I don't, I mean, you mentioned Gluck. I mean, he also has a statement somewhere in his interviews he's done that to speak of Leopoldo Lopez as as right wing is, quote, the ultimate in Orwellian doublespeak, unquote. Or he also compared it to calling Maya Angelou racist. Okay, so
wow.
I don't know what political orientation Mr. Gluck is, if he defines himself as progressive, but he a very strong Republican operative is saying that Leopoldo Lopez is a progressive, left of center. He surrounds himself with a lot of people that aren't, and you can see that in my article.
So let's talk about finally what his situation is. He is currently in prison. There was supposed to be a trial that was started. He has drawn attention to the fact that, or he's saying that he was doing a 30-day hunger strike. As far as you know, what lies in his fate?
Boy, I wish I could take this crystal ball and just answer that question, but I
mean, is there a trial that has begun?
His trial has gone on and off. It's been an ongoing, extended process. I haven't really delved into the details, the legalities and everything. I was focused more on what I've been discussing here with you now. And I think that ultimately the fate of Venezuela depends, I think, in part on how he's perceived inside and outside of Venezuela. It's not just that. It also depends on the price of oil. It depends on what happens with the elections in coming up in December.
Right.
For the legislature, and it's going to be interesting, and you may very well have the opposition win the majority in the legislature, which would unleash, I think, a whole nother dynamic. Maduro is president until 2019, so and the opposition, in the last several years has lost 18 of the last 19 elections to the Chavistas. So one of the ways that you can look at Lopez and Lopez's movement is as a kind of taking what one pollster called the radical, quote unquote, approach and taking it to the streets. And, in the face of all those losses, the electoral, Lopez and his movement voice support for elections, but there's tensions within the opposition about, how much credence to put into the elections, how much to actually negotiate with the Maduro government, how much, how much,
Right.
Who gets credit and things like that. There are very strong differences within the Venezuelan opposition. And
Right.
so that's one of the things that's I think important to note in my article, and that isn't as written about as I think should in the mainstream media. That you're dealing with personalities that are very divided, with organizations. It's a galaxy of opposition organizations, of which Leopoldo Lopez is one.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Roberto, for joining us. And we'll post a link to your article in Foreign Policy on our website, Uprising with Sonali, later today. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Sonali.
Roberto Lovato is a writer for The Nation magazine and a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for Latino Policy Research. His article for Foreign Policy is entitled The Making of Leopoldo Lopez. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.